Sponsorem programu jest Orlen.
Feminist satire. In English, those two words are not very often put together, but they seem to work well to me. So satire is about attacking dominant ideologies and extremist ideologies. And Agnieszka has curated this show to display the work that I do that has attacked three main areas of ideology which I see as extremist forms of thinking. So one of them is Islamism, which is a sort of fundamentalist religious extremism. Another is the sex trade, which I also see as a form of extreme ideology. It's an attack on women in particular, in which one sex is for sale to the other. And could only grow out of a form of very extreme ideology. And the third is gender ideology, which I also perceive as a form of religion in a way. It's a belief system, and which has taken on some extremist ideas now, which are having a very serious impact in some cases on the lives of women in particular. I trained as a painter, and I turned to ceramics initially. There are two main reasons. One of them is a formal reason, which is I actually do make pots. It's not so much the qualities of the material that excite me, so I don't make sort of abstract sculptures with it. It is actually pots that interest me. So formally, I'm restricted only by the top and the base, and around the circumference of a pot, there is this possibility of a sort of infinite space to explore. And I'm also very, very interested in narrative. And this movement, dynamic movement of a pot that it turns, is a perfect field for allowing a narrative to unfold. So that's one reason. The other reason is that ceramics brings with them a very, very long history, as you said. And it's not for no reason are they our museum pieces, our archaeological evidence. So there's a great many sort of cultural ideas and memories connected to ceramics. And it also has quite a long history of protest, but also dominant ideologies and politics as well. Thinking about actually Russian revolutionary ceramics, for example, when the Bolsheviks brought in young Russian artists, and in the very early years, these were exciting revolutionary ideas. It quickly turned to become government dogma, and then became propagandist in really the worst sense of the word. And many of the original artists left and they went to France. And interestingly, those ceramics, they didn't work as everyday objects that could be used as home because they were too expensive. So they became export items, and they were actually used to bring in hard currency. So there's a marvelous irony in that. But, conversely, porcelain, that was used as diplomatic gifts. It's associated with kings and queens and empires. Earthenware, which I use, associated much more with sort of the people's history, if you will. In Britain, you can find all sorts of interesting records of very marginalised histories, tucked away in the upper stories of museums. And history, some of them very personal, some of them just the records of births and deaths, some of them to do with things that happened in villages, some are to do with small town protests. For example, the cotton riots in the north of England are remembered on mugs. Most of these are quite forgotten stories. So that's another strength that ceramics has. And also it's ubiquitous. It's also, from a feminist point of view, it's It has a female association. These are objects used in the kitchen. They're domestic objects. So it has that dimension as well. I've certainly found it a very rich narrative theme to use in my work, my own work. And one other thing which is to do with its material is that pots can be broken and mended. And the viewer will notice, audiences have seen already, that some of my pots are broken and mended. I tend to break pots in response to very traumatic narratives. And I use it as a metaphor for trauma and survival. So it's based on a phrase in English, which is, I was shattered. Now I'm piecing myself slowly back together. And I find that basic idea, that metaphor, is replicated in a great many languages. The idea of the broken lives, the broken heart, the broken person, and the restoration of that human life. And I have found this to be a very helpful way of exploring traumatic events in women's lives, but also in anybody's lives. And it frees me from the need to actually repeat pictorially the violence that is done to women. I can express that violence by smashing the pot and then mending it. So it's a wonderful medium for expressing the idea of survival. So this one is called I'm Not the Criminal, and this is in some ways quite a triumphant piece. It is satire. This is a very good example, I think, of feminist satire. I hope so anyway. This one, I've portrayed the sex trade on the outside of the pot, and I portrayed it using the merry-go-round. It's really chaotic, this merry-go-round. The horses are broken free and they're sort of biting the men. And I've depicted the men as grotesques. These are the sort of the pimps, the men who exploit women and make money out of them. Also, we call them punters in English, or johns, and those are the men who pay for sex. And so also exploit women. So this is part of what you'll hear sometimes women calling the sort of legitimized rape culture, and that also extends into pornography and all aspects of the sex trade, including, and well, perhaps we could say especially online these days. This pot, it was made and then fired once, and then I took it to a demonstration, actually more like a procession, in Bradford in the north of England. And it was to mark and remember the deaths of all the women that had been murdered in the sex trade since records have been kept since the 1970s. And so we went in procession to the central square in Bradford. We called out the names of all the women, and then we had a minute's silence. The end of the silence, I smashed the pot and then collected up the pieces and took them back to the studio, and then glazed the pieces, put them back together again. And on the inside, you will see an image of Fiona Broadfoot, who's a sex trade survivor, and she campaigned and continues to campaign for the decriminalisation of women exploited in the sex trade, women and girls, all prostituted persons actually, and for the criminalisation of the men who exploit the women and the men who rape and abuse the women and pay for sex. So those are the men depicted on the outside. And so this is sort of a bit different from some of the others because she's in a way bursting her way out of this trap. And she's depicted on the inside along with this procession that took place in Bradford. And then these are the sort of the broken images of those who exploit. I'm Not the Criminal as a reference to a judicial review, which was really the first part in which sex trade survivors have really tried to reform the laws of prostitution in Britain, which are a real mess and which make life extremely difficult for women, especially, and girls. So that it is the case now that the convictions that a lot of women have on their record, criminal convictions, now don't have to be declared if they apply for a job, because that used to be something they always had to declare. It was a huge barrier for them for moving out of the sex trade and into a different life altogether and being able to find a different life. So this has now been successfully removed, and that's just stage one. There's still quite a long way to go. But this pot seems to me quite an important historical record and a record of survival. Sometimes it feels as though there is this kind of war, attempts coming from different directions to roll back women's rights, hard-won rights. And those attacks come in different forms. In the UK, we have this attack on women's protected spaces, so things like refuges, and that one in particular that is one that concerns me. Women-only refuges. These are for women escaping men's violence, and then. But also more everyday spaces like changing rooms and public toilet provision. These are spaces where women are getting undressed. They're spaces where women are vulnerable, and for that reason, we need separate spaces, because we know that the predatory male will use them if they are not protected spaces. And at the moment, the gender ideological movements are trying to claim that anybody can identify as a woman and then enter a female space. So what that means is the predatory male is in a position to identify as female, enter women's changing rooms, as they have done and continue to do, enter women's public toilets, as they have done and continue to do. They also find ways into women's prisons, where some of the most vulnerable women are being incarcerated, actually. So, and those women have no other choice. There is nowhere for them to go. They can't get away. They can't even leave one room and go into another without permission. Those are boundaried spaces. So women's choice to move, to get away from a predatory male, is profoundly restricted in a prison. And then the same, in many ways, is true of a refuge and women-only services that are provided. So, for example, the rape crisis counselling services, they're now under enormous pressure to not only provide services to men who identify as women, but also to accept men identifying as women as counsellors or into the support groups. Well, this is no good for a woman who actually is in real need of women-only space to kind of unfold and talk about the trauma that she has lived through and find a way of living with it and surviving with it. So those are the spaces that are under attack, I think, in particular from gender ideology and its exponents and the men who wish to take advantage of it. Those attacks are always there. There is an enormous resentment of women's achievements, I think, by certain groups of men. They really don't like it. And there will always be attempts to roll back what we've achieved. So these things are not new, and I think they will continue into the future, and I think we will always have to be on our guard.
Sponsorem programu był Orlen.